it comes to desk.
Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. The title of this session.
He did his homework.
Today's session, morning session, is entitled "Rethinking the Formal-Informal Divide." Before I talk about the speakers, we have 3 papers. We're going to have 20 minutes each to have around half an hour for a discussion. But before I start introducing the first speaker, I want to acknowledge the efforts of Salwa Sabbagh in setting up the exhibition yesterday. While the students were finalizing their models, she was taking care of all the other stuff in the exhibition. So on behalf of the studio, thank you, Salwa. Student in the MED program. Okay, our first speaker is Yasser A. Adanah. He's a development specialist and researcher based in Istanbul. He's a PhD candidate at the Department of International Urbanism at Stuttgart University. His research focuses on the issues of democracy and the city, urban governance, and urban transformation. Today he's going to speak on moving beyond the dichotomy, urban informality in Istanbul.
Thank you. I think I have to open this. Good morning. Before moving into my presentation, I would like to remember those innocent people died in 1915. We were discussing a lot of particular field examples, and I am myself also heavily involved at a very local level with various informal communities in Istanbul and elsewhere. But today I want to a bit zoom out from this field level and narrate the changing meaning of informality in a city like Istanbul, in a rapidly globalizing city. I will do this in 3 parts. Look at the Istanbul today, try to portray through one example what sort of city that we are facing now and the meaning of informality in that city. Then try to define informality / illegal aspects in a global city context. And finally look at the evolution of this informal city over the contemporary history of Turkey. Have you ever seen this guy before? He's quite famous around the region. His name is Orhan Gencebay, a heroic arabesque singer in Turkey. And he's publicly known as Orhan Baba, Father Orhan, because of his strong character and his emphasis on social justice, peace, humanism. So he has a special place among the urban poor. In his famous movie from 1978, My Troubles Are Larger Than the World, he fights against a mean developer who wants to demolish an informal neighborhood. Orhan Baba sits firmly in front of the bulldozers coming to demolish the Gecekondu, the informal neighborhood, and the rest of the community joins him. The solidarity among the people and the act of resistance forces bulldozers to retreat from the neighborhood. So this was a movie made after 3 decades of formation of the first Gecekondus in the city. And the second picture on the right is from last year. After another 3 decades on the movie on the left, Orhan Baba is acting in a high-rise gated community commercial this time. And he was saying everyone deserves to live in such a luxurious way, without mentioning the potential threat of such developments on the neighborhoods that he was defending in the past. So the transformation of Orhan Baba is actually the transformation of not only our cities today, but also our minds and our hearts. So, and Gecekondu, where Orhan was defending in the past, is the term we use in Turkish context, signify this universal phenomena. literally means built overnight or landed at night, which highlights the urgency of its formation and the need to conceal behind the security of night to complete the first stage of the construction. More than 65 years has passed since their recognition as a distinct urban phenomenon requiring specific laws and policies in Turkey. It is a term still used by various actors today, even though the extreme spatial, social, and cultural transformation had already been experienced. So what does Gecekondu mean in a global city such as Istanbul? So the Act, Gecekondu Act from 1966, number 775, refers to buildings constructed independent of building and urban codes and on someone else's land without prior consent of its proprietor and public authorities. So at the heart of the meaning lies a multidimensional extra-legality which associates Gecekondu with an urban abnormality requiring an intervention. Informal, illegal, illegitimate line of thinking was from the very beginning present and still valid today, which make it impossible to articulate the phenomena and engage with the right policies. It could be argued that the extra-legality in Istanbul is the norm. That cannot be reduced to Gecekondus only. Illicit construction of extra floors and legalizing them by construction amnesties is a widespread practice. Privileged building permits bypassing urban codes to certain real estate projects is also common. Privatization of public spaces and allowing commercial projects such as construction of luxurious hotels or shopping malls replacing the city park at the center of the city is also within the boundaries of possibility. So extra-legality of formal urbanism paves the way into untaxed multi-billion dollars earnings to special interest groups. The example on the slide, Four Winds Istanbul, is a residences visible throughout the city could make a profit of extra $800 million just by the provision of generous building permits. Wouldn't be possible for the neighboring buildings. But extra-legality of the formal city not only enhances the social inequalities, but also endangers the crucial resources necessary for all the urban inhabitants, humans and non-humans. The northern part of Istanbul, reserved as water and forestry ecological protection zone at the master plan of Istanbul approved in 2009, is being subjected to mega projects, building an intercontinental bridge and a new connecting highway, the world's largest airport, the new Istanbul satellite city for 2 million inhabitants, a new Olympic village, and the Canal Istanbul, Turkish version of the Suez Canal, are all the recent mega projects officially labeled as MAT projects that signifies our ambition to become a global city. So the white-colored urban informality and its overall impact on the city should provide a checkpoint for understanding and engaging with the blue-colored informality of the working and the middle-class neighborhoods and Gecekondus. So most of urban expansion of Istanbul took place since 1950s, coinciding, not surprisingly, the emergence of the Gecekondus. With the city of almost 15 million inhabitants today, by the end of the 40s, it was just a dying ex-imperial capital of the young Republic of Turkey. So what the maps on the slide show is that the historical and the magical Istanbul, as it is preferred to be presented by the Turkish Tourism Board, does not really represent the enormous informal expansion of the city. So what really Istanbul is something completely different than what it was in a century ago. With varying degrees of regularization, the initially informally developed areas constitutes up to 70% of the urban fabric today. And now this informality is at the center of the contemporary urban transformation of the globalizing city. The dominant contemporary urbanization model promoted by the state and the market mechanism is the production of the class-specific and profit-seeking urban islands of housing, consumption, entertainment, services, and connecting them with the transport infrastructure, industry is being decentralized in this process. The sketch on the left shows the neatly separated urban islands of functions of the new satellite city, the new Istanbul, the mass housing, the Olympic town, the town for entertainment on the bottom, a health city having the biggest hospital in the town, and the reds are the shopping malls. All these developments put pressure of transformation on the informally developed yet radically evolved areas of the city. The map shows those neighborhoods mostly informally developed and which are vulnerable to these dynamics of the global city building. So the meaning of this pressure on the informally developed areas can only be understood by contextualizing the development of gecekondu's historically. So in the context of Istanbul, we can look the formation and evolution of gecekondus in 4 distinct periods. I prefer to call them urbanization of the state, starting from the Republic, foundation of the Republic until the end of the Second World War, urbanization of the labor force, and after the 1980s, urbanization of the capital in 2 different phases. The first stage starts with the foundation of this new nation state, Turkish Republic, in desperate need to break radically with its Ottoman heritage and to build a new nation out of it. Modeled around the Western modernization, the project championed by a small elite, urban elite, with a top-down rule of one-party system. Nation's capital was moved to Ankara, to a small, insignificant town. It was a period of state-led community development for mostly rural population, via establishment of railroad networks and setting up factories throughout the country, with a limited success. But this was the aim, overall development of the nation. So hence the city itself was a place to be produced, a place to be planned out of scratch in this mostly rural environment. And gecekondu, our subject matter, was an invisible issue yet. And not surprisingly, the first gecekondus start to be recorded in this new capital, Ankara. Oops, sorry. So we move into the second phase, the phase of urbanization of the labor force. At the end of the Second World War, Turkey moved to a multi-party system that allowed populist politics to counter the elitist policies of the early republic. Found itself right on top of the Cold War borders, Turkey immediately started to receive US foreign support, Marshall Aid, that paved the way into mechanization of agricultural sector. So between 1951 and 1953, Turkey received 40,000 tractors directly from US, which freed more than 1 million villagers from the rural areas without job. The rural to urban migration and the consequent urbanization via gecekondu formation also shaped the discussions around the identity of the new immigrants, as the villagers in the city, culturally inferior, the other of the urban. The second major factor fueled the migration was the industrialization for import substitution. So the city immediately became the place of reproduction of the labor. The rural migrants initially come to Istanbul, end of 40s. They come to a city planned by a French urban planner, Prost. It was a city still haven't lost the optimism on the possibility of planning a city. But as early as 1946, the first gecekondus in Istanbul start to appear in Kazlıçeşme, just out of the city, historical city walls. By the year 1949, there were 5,000 gecekondus, and in a decade, the number of gecekondu settlements increased to 61,000. And there was a big infrastructural investment in this initial phase in the 1950s, which required the cheap labor of these newcomers. Hence, the gecekondu inhabitants were not only building their informal city at the outskirts of the town, but also the formal city at the heart of the Istanbul. And when we move to 1960s, the limited resources of the nation was reserved for the investment in industrialization. Housing need of the labor force, in a way, had to be resolved by the workers themselves. Hence, the Gecekondu settlements mushroom around the factories on the state-owned land, as you can see, which was the state's contribution to the industrialization process, so which was often used as a leverage for populist politics. If you look at this initial phase of production of the Gecekondu, we see a very social production of space. It was all about the social production. The calculated decision on choosing the land to squat was informed and supported by the existing social networks and by the origin of village and hometowns. Community-based organization was formed at a very early stage for advocating the rights of the settlements and collectively voicing the pragmatic, the material needs, such as the access to urban services and the security of tenure. The frequent demolition threat was countered by the Gecekondu collectivity. And if the demolition was inevitable, the immediate reconstruction was carried out through the social mobilization. So we see a cycle of social production of space from all the stages of formation, demolition, and reconstruction of Gecekondus. And if you look at the politician, how they perceived this development, from the very early days of the Gecekondus, the politicians never let the carrot and the stick go off their hands. Overall, they were welcoming the informal. Land and construction amnesties were introduced as early as the year after the emergence of the first Gecekondu in Istanbul in 1949. One member of parliament states in the beginning of 1960s, before approving the Gecekondu law, it is a creative miracle. Another states, Gecekondu is the solution to the housing problem. Another member says, democracy is a race to be civilized, and the villagers want to be civilized, and Gecekondu is the demonstration of this demand. And the report sent to UN to ask their support for slum upgrading program, it is stated, urbanization and Gecekondu is not regarded as a negative process in Turkey. On the contrary, they will have a positive impact on the national development because the heavy industrialization expected in the 70s will be fueled from these areas. So it was an open declaration that Gecekondu self-help building is the policy. This is important because informality / illegality always, I would require a few more minutes, but I will. Always been associated from politics to the different actors in the society. But this was actually the officially the way to deal with the Gecekondu. So from the early days of the recognition of the Gecekondu problem, demolition was not promoted as the first option. The first law on Gecekondu was in 1958. The first amnesty was on 1949, amnesty on the occupied lands. 1966, we have the Gecekondu law with the name explicitly stating Gecekondu, which identify areas for improvement, prevention, and demolition. And demolition was only the case if those living in the terrible conditions cannot improve their living condition. So it was a much more holistic approach way back in the 60s. But if you look at the former designer, the architects, and the planners, they were not as adaptive as the politicians. The editor of the famous architectural magazine, Architect, the most famous at that time in Turkey, states that now there's an illegal town in Ankara, a whole town, a town which covers hills around the castle. In the 60s, the Chamber of Architects simply couldn't get along with the idea of undesigned, unplanned settlements mushrooming and the state policy of accepting this reality and legalizing via amnesties and letting people to integrate to the urban fabric. The emphasis of the Chamber of Architects was on an alternative solution, such as directly production of social housing, the expropriation of the whole urban land and giving permit to use, but not to own the land. But at the same time, we see some sort of, we observe an architectural fascination with this self-help building process and the organic development over time. There were a lot of studies trying to understand the dynamics behind this spatial production. From the broader public, the media, Gecekondu arose almost a voyeuristic interest. There were journalists spending months in the Gecekondu areas and reporting for their newspapers from within the neighborhoods. Owning a TV, for instance, has a value to make a news about it. And the Turkish cinema, they start to use the theme around Gecekondu as early as 1915. And the first movie titled with Gecekondu, Seeking Gecekondu, was produced in 1967. So Sema Erder, a renowned scholar studying Gecekondus in Turkey, she summarizes the different perceptions of the community in this innocent period of the Gecekondu. For the urban man, Gecekondu people were the cheap and the obedient reserve labor required for the production. For the urban woman, they were the cheap house workers required to be educated but necessary. For the politicians, they were the vote depot. As long as they are appeased, they will keep voting. And those authorities in charge of bringing the services, they were the common people, not as demanding and not as unsatisfied as the urban citizens. But already by the end of 60s, beginning of 70s, the initial phase of the commercialization had begun. The Gecekondus started to verticalize and get consolidated, also encouraged by the land amnesties. And getting the status of mahalle, neighborhood, allowed the inhabitants to vote for the muhtar, the headman, the lowest level of elected representative in Turkish administration system. At the same time, the Gecekondu renting scheme had started. So they were getting more and more socially diverse, complex communities with different interests and power among the members. By the end of 70s, more organized groups, so-called land mafia, started to divide the plots and sell to newcomers for profit. So later this parcelization of land and reselling, legally and or illegally, were also brought into the formal system. So we can conclude this phase stating that, yes, I see it's 19 minutes. Even though the official policy was to regularize the informal, demolition was utilized time to time as a stick in the hand of the state. There were urban battles in the 70s between the municipal police and the people in various neighborhoods, especially at those newly establishing Gecekondus. During the heydays of the political activism of 70s, socialists took side with the Gecekondu communities, establishing cells and doing outreach work at the neighborhoods for class consciousness and revolution. April resistance of 1 Mayıs Mahallesi, May Day neighborhood against the demolition was one of such heroic action. Many had died and more wounded. This was the most important history of the Gecekondu formation in Turkey from 1945 to almost 1980. And considering the time that left, I will just briefly move on to the next phases to see how this phenomenon has changed by the year 1980, which was a very significant year for the world, but also for the Turkey. There was a military intervention in the country that changed the country's policies totally in a different direction. President has been brought directly from World Bank, Turgut Özal, and he shifted all the policies into adjustment to neoliberal policies following the Thatcher and the Reagan. And the city itself became a space not for reproduction of the labor anymore, but a space that means to accumulate capital. It was the initial period from 1980s to 2000. It was not as radical as what we have been observing in the last 10 years. But that was the new policy direction. City is a place that we need to invest for the sake of the investment. So speedily, all these little Gecekondu neighborhoods, they turn into Gecekondu cities. Some academics call them post-Gecekondu phenomena. So it was not as innocent as in the past, but it was keep inhabiting the newcomers to the city in a very different environment, in a more open market economy, in a more vulnerable society, together with the forced migration of the Kurdish population, that creates a completely new conflict in the society. And it changed the image of the Gecekondu people from those deserving poor, as was summarized by Sema Erder, to into culture of poverty. Those people that the only way to deal with them is those parasitic people, only to deal with them something else, which we see this something else since 2000, designating the whole areas for total demolition and reconstruction kind of, and relocating of the Gecekondu communities into newly constructing mass houses. I'm wrapping up. The social houses building all around the city, but these are not social in the sense that they are being sold with full coverage to the owners, indebting the Gecekondu people. And it's promoted by the local authorities as a brilliant act of policy. Once it exists, talking about the Gecekondu neighborhood, now it is gone. And this is the kind of radical intervention, that radical images of changes that we had experienced in the last 10 years, before of and then after. Also in the inner city areas. So we make this map in 2009, the map of forced eviction, trying to see the threat of forced evictions at different levels all around the city. But we can say that, maybe I can conclude with that. Of course, this is a very dynamic and dialectical process. A state and the market is not just evicting thousands and just rebuilding whatever. But they are learning from this resistance and from the annoyance of the people. So we see another policy shift from evictions to win-win situation, but win not in an equal terms, obviously. So in few months ago, 6 months ago, we had this new campaign called The Transformation Starts, which had already been started 10 years ago, but in the last few years, in the last few months, it started again. And this time the deal was invest in the entrepreneurial individual. If you all come together and make a deal with a developer, a private developer, you can receive 4 times more building permits. So if half of you come together, you get 2 times more building permits. So the idea was to deal with the conflict, let's make everyone imagine the potential of urban profit for all those, for the multimillionaires and for the very lowest strata of the society. Let's all imagine a different city, a city to make profit. So now we have a bunch of private companies. They are doing the urban transformation as a sector. And those who are resisting still to the process are being labeled as the terrorists from the very high to the bottom level of the politicians. And those who doesn't want to buy into this kind of entrepreneurial individual who wants a different future. Thank you.